Well, hello everybody. Glad to have you join us again here in World Civilization 1. Today we will be talking about the Middle Ages. And as always, when we do these video lectures, remember you can always hit pause, get caught up on notes. You can hit reverse and pick up on something that I might have said. And of course, this really is a great opportunity for you to listen, take some notes, and then when we return together in class, I generally can fill in some of those gaps. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the Middle Ages. And again, if you have questions, jot them down, and when we meet together in class, we can go from there. Before we begin, I hope everyone's having a great day, and hope everything is well in your world. So let's just jump right into it. I would point out to you that there are three specific periods of this time we call the Middle Ages. As you can see here, it's sometimes called the medieval period as well. And we have the early Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages, and the late Middle Ages. A lot of what we will be talking about today will be here in the high and the late period. And I generally, beyond this point, won't say we're in the high or late, but this kind of gives you a breakdown. Some very specific themes of the Middle Ages that I think will become very apparent as we begin to look at a lot of this content. One is a time of great violence. There is significant warfare throughout the Western and Central Europe that would warrant this theme of a time of war and violence. This second one, the blending of great European civilizations, really speaks to we're starting to see the boundaries of a lot of European countries that we even have today really have some of their foundation in this time frame. Now, I would say that the geography will shift in terms of these European civilizations, and we'll talk about that as I really kind of speak to various groups who can hold power and then lose power. This is significant. Blending of Greco-Roman and Germanic traditions within the framework of the Christian Church. And really, it is showing the influence of Greece and Rome and how powerful that was, that the Romans embraced that Greek philosophy and engineering and democracy and all of that. They rolled it into their own. And then, of course, we're going to see the rise of these Germanic traditions. Really, this is really the rise of Germany, although we may not know it as that title. And then the final thing that kind of goes along with that is the emerging science clashing with religion. And you could certainly say that really hasn't gone away. I think you're always going to have some science perspectives that do not agree with religious perspectives. Now, in a modern time, some of that has been able to been brought together, but certainly in this time of the Middle Ages, we're going to see the rise of science and how it will clash certainly with religion. Just some basic geographic considerations as you are thinking about Europe during the Middle Ages. Europe was blessed with incredibly dense forests. Not only certainly is that a fuel source for firewood, but home building and shipbuilding dependent upon the particular nation or region. And that is really just significant. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, over time, those dense forests gave way to man. They were chopped down. Rich black earth for growing crops. Some of the best farmland in the world in Europe. And again, this is all going to kind of play into part of the consideration here as I put geographic considerations, because honestly, this is going to be the breadbasket for Europe. The surrounding seas not only become an ideal food source, but it really becomes, as I put here, the highway to the rest of the world. Future exploration, trade, conquest, all of those elements that you and I can begin to look at and touch, meaning the arrival of the Spanish and later the English and the French, all of that is the beginning point right here. And this is where I really want to officially begin talking about. As that Roman Empire fell, again, officially in 476 CE, that old Roman territory, today we would see it as modern-day Germany, at least a portion of it, and France will fall to those various barbarian invaders, the Goths, the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, the Huns, and the Franks. All of them are, again, under that generic title of barbarian. And this is really, I think, a good beginning point to understand how, excuse me, some of these great European civilizations really had their beginning form. Between 400 and 700 CE, again, that would be CE or AD, a lot of these little Germanic tribes begin to carve up a lot of Western Europe into small kingdoms. The best way to think of these Germanic tribes carving up these little kingdoms is that old game, and I've mentioned this in class before, but think about that old game that we played as kids, King of the Hill, where someone can hold that territory just exactly as I stated, as long as they can hold that territory. And so sometimes the shapes of these nations or little kingdoms will change dramatically depending upon who the leader is. The Franks, or the Franks, it depends on how you wish to enunciate that, are one of the strongest and most successful of those Germanic tribes, certainly in the High Middle Ages. And even a portion of the early Middle Ages. In 481, the Frankish leader is a young man named Clovis. And two things I would note about Clovis. One, he became king at age 15. That's significant, obviously due to his youth, but he's also what we would call a long-haired king. And of course, the idea of a long-haired king, I think we can understand that to mean that he was a very powerful individual. Obviously, if you wanted to make a biblical reference to that, it would be the story of Samson, and he derived his strength from his long hair. And so a lot of comparison historically is made to Clovis and his strength and his hair there. One of the great stories that comes out of the Middle Ages about the Franks are the Franks and the Alemanni. Another group of the Middle Ages, are in battle. And Clovis, standing on a hillside, seeing his men being slaughtered, he remembered the words of his wife, who had been a convert to Christianity. Clotilde had urged Clovis to become a Christian, but he had ignored those things. But as he is seeing his men be slaughtered, he remembers her words, and you can see his urgent prayer. Now, according to history, as soon as he delivered his prayer, the Alemanni will flee the battle and the Franks will win. And Clovis, taking that truly as a sign of his newly found Christian faith, he took them to the local bishop and had all some 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 of his men baptized. Now, I would suggest that Clovis, in many ways, being this strong, dynamic leader, that serves a great purpose, but it also, as I have talked about in the past, when you have such a dynamic, strong, powerful leader, when they die, it leaves a power vacuum. And in 511, when Clovis dies, his territories are divided among his sons. But we don't really see that his sons are that effectual as leaders. And no one, certainly none of those boys, will step up and assume that title of king. It really is this kind of wide open scenario. Part of that is, I think it's incredibly big shoes to fill. Clovis is seen as an incredible, powerful leader, and to assume that role would be significant. Now, someone eventually will be chosen to rule under Clovis's name, and the first of those is Charles Martel. Charles Martel historically is loved by the people, loved by his men. They loved his strength and his courage. And if you recall back at our PowerPoint, we talked about the rise of ancient Islam. It is Charles Martel who led that Christian army and defeated the Muslims at the Battle of Tours. And you can see here it's in 732 CE. Now, when Charles Martel dies, he will leave the rule, if you will. Again, they're ruling under Clovis's name, to his son, someone we know as Pepin the Short. And so Pepin the Short becomes the new leader of the Germanic Empire, or this Frankish Empire. Excuse me. And in this time frame, I don't think people really understood the significance of what exactly happened here. Because as you can see from my PowerPoint here, Pepin did not like that idea of ruling under another ruler's name, especially someone who is so far removed. And he will do something by asking the Pope for the full right to the Germanic throne. And the Pope will grant the request. And the two questions I ask here are, is this a new direction in ruling? And why significant? And the answer to that is that it really allowed the church to strengthen its power even further within Western Christianity and Western Europe. The fact that a king is now asking a pope for permission or the right to rule would suggest that the power of the church and the pope and of Christianity is greater than that of the king. And it really established a new pecking order in terms of power. Now in 768, when Pepin the Short dies, he will leave the throne to his son Charles. Most often we know Charles by his French name, which is Charlemagne. And in a more English version of that, it is Charles the Great. And I think if you were to visit Germanic cities, you will find in many of them there is a reference certainly to Charles the Great, and in many cases you will find statues honoring his time, if you will, as the king of this Germanic empire. Some things here, and by the way, the image here would show you that the coronation of Charlemagne, and obviously you see the Catholic bishops around there, and that would be the Pope who is granting his permission and crowning Charlemagne here. Charlemagne will rule from 768 to 814. It's a significant amount of time to rule. Probably some of the best known things about Charlemagne is he revived education. He really saw the value in it. Don't take that to mean that everyone all of a sudden had a free public education. He just began to see the value in that education. He kept accurate records. A lot of the ability that you and I have today to trace ancestry back, especially if you are of European ancestry, really I like to attribute that some to Charlemagne. The process of churches, even in this time frame, of indicating births and deaths and family lineages and all part of a church record, I think many times is due to Charlemagne. He is also responsible for strengthening the church powers that we will be talking about in the remaining courses here. Under Charlemagne and other Western rulers, Christianity became the dominant religion in Western Europe, and we really see what I call here the shared governance model. And if you read through this here, you can certainly see the church doctrine. These were two very important church themes, the warning of eternal damnation, and also, of course, the message of salvation through the use of sacraments. Translation here, if you don't go to church, if you don't go through the process and the traditions and the rituals of the church, then you're really not receiving this. And so those were two significant things. If that message failed, and it does fail at times, the church would use what I would call spiritual weapons. The two largest ones are excommunication. That would be for an individual member who is not necessarily in compliance, and they would not be allowed to participate in church activities. The more significant one would be what we call interdiction, where the church would suspend all church activities in a particular area until people started to straighten up and follow, the church teachings and so on and so forth. It's also just right after the beginning of the High Middle Ages that we see the establishment of the first monasteries. Generally, we attribute the first monastic order to Benedict. And by the way, you can look in your textbook. There's a great excerpt about Benedict and some of the rules that he applied as he established this first monastery. The Benedictine nuns were established by Scholastica, and by the way, she was Benedict's sister. I just mentioned three of these groups. Beyond the Benedictine order, you have the Cistercians, the Clunians, the Franciscans, and there certainly are many, many more. A quick note about monastic life. They are generally closed societies. They kept to themselves. They certainly they all had various vows, but many of them were the ones that were here. Limited means. You didn't have a lot of nice possessions. Everyone kept very simple possessions. You took a vow to obey all superiors, and really essentially anyone was a superior. And again, a vow of poverty, a vow of chastity. Those, of course, are all designed to keep you pure, and your love and devotion is you're married essentially to the church, and not drawn away or have desirous feelings or thoughts about other things or even people. And you'll see many of the monastic societies generally adopted that same style of haircut, the open, the shaved head, if you will. There's a lot of theories about, one, this was to replicate the crown of thorns that Jesus would have worn. Some it's a show of slavery. You are to the master of the church. There's several reasons of why the hairstyle was in that manner. Now, of course, despite the spiritual weapons and the church themes and the monastic communities and the incredible pressure of the church, there simply are those who don't believe, or what I would say had a different opinion. I provide a couple of examples here. The Valdensians, their big issue was that they felt like it would be appropriate for a common man to also administer the sacrament. I can tell you, obviously, the church disagreed with that. The Albigensians went a bit further. They didn't feel like they really didn't even need the presence of the church. This would be the Albigensians here. They saw that the world really was a fight or struggle between good and evil. That, of course, would contradict what the church would say, that there is a devil and the presence of God. The Albigensians, the Valdensians, individuals who began to question the church and church doctrine became a growing concern. And you can see here Pope Gregory IX in 1231 will enact what we call the Inquisition to combat heresy. And this really became such a controversial piece, the Inquisition. I want to show you this particular piece. Depending on the region, this here in Spain we would call the auto de fe, or an act of faith, was the public reading and execution of the sentence during the Inquisition. And really what the Inquisition, in a very simplistic fashion, was the designation that you had committed a crime against the church, against God and against church teachings, and you were then, in a very public fashion, tortured, with the desired result to be that you would somehow denounce your heretic views and say, I take it back, I'm a believer. And as you can imagine, a lot of people who were subject to the Inquisition, this inquiry of your faith, were very innocent, but really speaks to the idea that people began to question the church. Not questioning faith, but questioning some of the practices of the church. And the church certainly was not in the mood to be questioned. Now, we'll certainly come back to the role of the church, but I do want to shift for a moment and look at education in the Middle Ages. As European society developed, I would suggest it became more sophisticated, and there is a greater need in this new world that's emerging. We need people who can read and write, and as it says here, we need an educated and skilled workforce. And so there really was a need for institutions of higher education. And you can see some of the very first schools that were established were theological. These are church schools. They were where people of the faith were learning how to be part of the church. The same would be for the very first music schools. That music was all crafted around religious music, designed for the churches. But certainly Italy will lead the way in 1250 with the very first medical school. Germany introduced one of the first law schools. And really, what I find interesting about this particular time, by 1300, some of the very first liberal arts schools or education was introduced. The very things that many of you are taking as part of your curriculum here in the community college, grammar, geometry, astronomy, music, speech, all of those were part of this liberal arts education, and very much like a community college, some of the very first vocational education. Now, granted, here at Pueblo Community College, we don't teach you how to be a surgeon or a dentist, but we certainly do. We have a surgical technician program, we have dental hygiene, etc., etc. Quick note, the first universities were student control. You would make the final determination when you believed that you had mastered those subjects, and then you could essentially announce that, and you would be really in consultation with the head professor. It was agreed that you had mastered that subject. Now, one of the themes I talked about was science moving forward, but it certainly will clash with religion. I'm just going to mention a couple of individuals that just to really kind of give you an idea of what that may have looked like. Albertus Magnus, he was a Frenchman, Paris. He did one of the very first studies of optics and vision. He really led some groundbreaking research. What he was concerned about or had a question about is, what does the eye do? How does it work? What's its fun? And all of the intricacies of that. It's significant. His work led to later discoveries in optics. Avicenna wrote an important medical textbook. It was called the Canon of Medicine. Early doctors would have read this or studied this. It was really first-hand medical knowledge derived from someone who worked at a hospital. It was probably some of the first illustrations or drawings of the interior of the human body, and Avicenna was responsible for that. Equally, Trotula. Trotula was a medical doctor, and she was a woman, and she wrote on feminine disorders. That was the title of her book. It really is the first medical textbook that we're aware of that dealt with female anatomy and physiology. The question I pose here is the prior belief in male and female anatomy. Any ideas? I think if you got a sense of the first, not the first, but the normal or common person idea is that generally a lot of people believe that the male and female anatomy, specifically the genitalia, were identical. The exception would be as the man's genitalia protruded and the female genitalia went inward. And what that really suggests is really a lack of understanding of that, we men and women certainly have a different physiological makeup and different anatomy beyond just that kind of simple understanding. I want to talk about 1000 CE for just a moment, and don't take that in January 1st, 1000. I'm just suggesting around 1000. There's some interesting things that really change the whole kind of concept of what we might begin to identify as a modern world. For one, I find this interesting. Around 1000, there was this premillennial fear. There might be someone who's watching this video who remembers in 2000, buying cases of water and stocking up on crackers. And the concern in 2000, of course, was that our computers would no longer be able to allow our society to function. Electrical grids were going to shut down because the dates within computers were not prepared for that. We see certainly a certain fear that generated itself around 1000, and it's very likely that a lot of that fear was generated by the church, telling people that it's perhaps the end of an era and a time, and we all should be behaved, and so on and so forth. Also around 1000, we're seeing the advent of the water wheel and the windmill. This really is man's very early scientific attempt to harness some of the natural powers that are out there of wind and the sun, etc. Some agricultural changes that are significant. We will find huge chunks of time scattered throughout the Middle Ages where we don't see a lot of significant climatic changes. And when I put here warmer weather, there's been multiple years where there's not a late frost or an early frost. There's not, a drought. No significant changes that would alter a major food source. You take that combined with this curved metal plow. The previous plow was a wooden plow. It became brittle. It wasn't as strong. It frequently broke. And what the curved metal plow allowed them to do was to begin planting fields that previously would not have been planted. The same with the utilization now of the horse as being the primary animal, the beast of burden, if you will. And then the shift to a three-field system. By dividing the land in a three-field versus a one or two-field, they were able to plant more over time. The quality and the crop yield will improve, is going to lead to a greater amount of food, which means a greater lifestyle. People were healthier, they live longer, their immune system is strengthened, etc. And of course, healthier people generally are producing more and they can pay more taxes. And then the final two things that I think are interesting around 1000 was the rise of true towns. Communities that begin to be planned, and cobblestone streets, and significant government buildings, and not necessarily a city but a town. And we find a lot of them certainly around waterways. And then the final thing I mention here is time. I would suggest that it's time has always been measured for most people by the rise of the sun, and in the early morning, and where the sun is in the middle of the day might dictate your lunch. And then, of course, the sun setting in the evening would dictate your work hours and your conclusion of that. But we were going to see now communities build clock towers, and the time and the chiming of bells now begins to signal the beginning point, or the lunch break, or the afternoon prayers, or come attend church, and so on and so forth. So I find that very interesting, but also in a strange way, maybe even sad. I want to turn our attention now to the rise of Islam, and one of those components that we had previously talked about, and I mentioned as one of the components of the Middle Ages certainly will be the Crusades. And you can see from this map this growing influence of Islam as it begins to spread. So let's talk briefly about the Crusades. That term crusade is actually Latin. It's a Latin term for cross. And if you need a full definition of the Crusades, it would refer to a series of military expeditions by Western European Christians between 1095 and 1270 CE. Now, although there were numerous military groups that moved in the name of Christianity, we technically only list 4 as the actual Crusades. And one of those elements that I would point to a modern concept as well is that you can see from that third bullet point, Western Christians became alarmed by the conquest of Syria and Palestine by aggressive Muslim armies. I think it is interesting that certainly Western, not just Christians, but Western nations today are certainly concerned by the movement of significant or those Muslims that we might identify as the most aggressive or most orthodox. That would include ISIS today, as they are certainly trying to take control of Syria and other portions of Palestine. I also like to think that the Crusades are certainly driven by power and politics, by the popes, as I put here. I think it's a valid attempt in the 11th, 12th, and 13th century by different popes to increase their religious and political power. And I would have you think about back to Pepin the Short when he strengthened his power in that realm. And certainly there's an enormous amount of religious excitement. And as I put here, it's a great outlet for ambitious individuals and noblemen, wannabe knights who want to exercise this right for a great adventure. You'll see the first crusade began in 1095 CE in a little place called Clermont-Ferrand, France. And there Pope Urban II will urge the masses to participate. Participation that was actually seen as an act of penance. Within Catholicism, that act of penance is an acceptable way of demonstrating sorrow for your sin. The other really significant thing about understanding the Crusades, it was open to everyone, man, woman, and child, young and old. And certainly we know within the Crusades that young children participated. If you were not an actual combatant, you certainly also could play a role in some form. Maybe you were running supplies or you were helping the cause. Young and old, male, female, and again, even children. Just a couple of notes or some images here. This is an image that would show, again, regular soldiers, but also men, women, and children, adventurers, anyone. This very rich tapestry that we see from approximately 1096, again, that would be a year after the Crusades began, just richly shows all of the various battles and Christian armies, showing their force against Muslim armies. This image here is of Pope Urban II, again back in Clermont-Ferrand, France, urging the Catholic bishops to support the Crusades and the invasion of Islamic lands. Now, the Crusades will stem the tide of Islam for a period of time, but as we move closer and closer to really the end of the Middle Ages, it really takes us, into what we will begin talking about in history as the new modern world. And of course, part of what will move everyone's attention, certainly within Europe, will become the age of exploration. As we get into the late 1400s, early 1500s, and then throughout the 1500s, we will be looking at the arrival, certainly in North America, of the Spanish, the English, and the French. And we'll certainly be looking at all of that in a later time. So, as always, hope you had some questions here. Feel free to share those in class when we get together. And I appreciate you spending some time with me. We'll see you next time.